January 17th, 1940. The North Atlantic churns beneath a steel-gray sky, waves crashing against the hull of a British transport vessel cutting through frigid waters toward the Canadian coast. Below deck, in the dim cargo hold converted to temporary quarters, 200 German prisoners of war sit in silence. Most are sailors pulled from the wreckage of scuttled U-boats or merchant raiders intercepted in the opening months of the war. They wear salvaged clothing, mismatched and salt-stained. The air smells of diesel fuel, damp wool, and uncertainty. Through the porthole, one young sailor, barely 20 years old, catches his first glimpse of the new world. Snow-covered forests stretch endlessly along the shoreline. He has been told this land is primitive, that its people are weak, that the Reich will soon dominate the entire globe. But as the ship approaches Halifax harbor, something in the vastness of that wilderness stirs a question he dare not speak aloud. What if everything we were told was wrong? The prisoners disembark under armed guard, their boots crunching on snow-packed docks. Canadian soldiers watch them with expressions neither cruel nor kind, simply professional. The Germans expect brutality. They have been conditioned to believe that capture means torture, starvation, humiliation. The propaganda films shown in Berlin depicted Allied prison camps as death traps where men were worked to exhaustion and left to freeze. Yet as they are loaded onto trains heading inland, something unexpected happens. They are given blankets. Hot coffee is distributed in tin cups. A Red Cross volunteer, an elderly woman with kind eyes, hands out sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper. One prisoner, a former school teacher from Hamburg named Klaus Hartmann, later wrote in his diary, "I expected to be treated as we treated others. Instead, I was treated as a human being. This confused me more than any interrogation could have." The trains roll westward through the Canadian winter, past frozen lakes and small towns where children wave from farmhouse windows. The prisoners press their faces to the glass, watching a country that seems impossibly vast, impossibly peaceful. There are no bombed-out buildings here, no rubble-strewn streets, no columns of refugees fleeing advancing armies. The war, which has consumed Europe, feels like a distant nightmare in this place. They arrive at their destination after 3 days of travel, a newly constructed prisoner-of-war camp in the Ontario countryside, surrounded by pine forests and farmland. The camp is not what they imagined. The barracks are wooden but solid, with stoves for heating. There are latrines, showers, a mess hall, even a small library. The perimeter is fenced and guarded, yes, but there are no watchtowers with machine guns, no dogs straining at leashes, no officers screaming orders. A Canadian commandant addresses them in accented German, explaining the rules. Work will be required, but it will be paid. Medical care will be provided. Letters home will be permitted, subject to censorship. Complaints can be filed through proper channels. Escape attempts will be punished, but not with execution. The prisoners exchange glances, unsure whether to believe what they are hearing. The first weeks are a period of adjustment and suspicion. These men have been trained to see the world through the lens of National Socialist ideology. They have been taught that strength is the only virtue, that mercy is weakness, that the strong must dominate the weak or be destroyed. Canada, they were told, is a backwater colony of a dying British Empire, populated by farmers and lumberjacks who lack the discipline and will to fight a modern war. Yet the reality they encounter contradicts every lesson they learned in the Hitler Youth, every speech they heard at party rallies, every article they read in Der Stürmer. The guards are firm but not sadistic. The food, while simple, is plentiful. Each prisoner receives 3 meals a day, porridge and bread for breakfast, soup and vegetables for lunch, meat and potatoes for dinner. For men who left a Germany already tightening its belt under wartime rationing, this abundance is shocking. One prisoner, a mechanic from the Ruhr Valley, writes to his wife, "We eat better here than we did at home before the war. I do not understand it." Work details are organized. Some prisoners are assigned to logging operations in the surrounding forests, felling trees that will be processed into lumber for the war effort. Others work on farms, helping Canadian families bring in harvests while their sons are overseas fighting. The labor is hard, but it is not slave labor. The prisoners are paid a small wage in camp currency, which they can use to purchase cigarettes, toiletries, and other small comforts from the camp canteen. They work 8-hour days, not the brutal dawn-to-dusk shifts they expected. On Sundays, they rest. Some attend church services led by a German-speaking chaplain. Others play football in the camp yard or organize informal classes, teaching each other languages and skills. A sense of routine develops, and with routine comes something unexpected, a sense of normalcy. But it is the small interactions, the everyday encounters with ordinary Canadians, that begin to crack the ideological armor these men have worn since adolescence. A farmer whose son is fighting in Europe shares his lunch with a work detail, sitting on a stone wall and talking about the weather, the crops, the challenges of rural life. He does not speak of politics or war. He treats the prisoners as fellow workers, not as enemies. A school teacher in a nearby town donates books to the camp library, novels, histories, even some German classics that have been banned back home. A doctor in the camp infirmary, a middle-aged man from Toronto, treats a prisoner's infected wound with the same care he would give any patient, explaining the procedure in halting German and refusing to accept thanks. "It is my job," he says simply. These moments accumulate like snowflakes, each one small and fragile, but together they form something substantial. Klaus Hartmann, the former schoolteacher, becomes a keen observer of this strange new world. He keeps a detailed diary, recording not just the facts of camp life, but his own evolving thoughts and doubts. In March 1940, he writes, "Today I saw a guard share his cigarette with a prisoner who had none. This would never happen in Germany, not between a guard and a prisoner, perhaps not even between comrades. We are taught that kindness is weakness, that only the hard survive. But these Canadians are not weak. They have built a nation in a harsh land. They are fighting a war across an ocean, yet they do not abandon their humanity. What does this mean? What have we become, that such simple decency seems strange to us?" The prisoners begin to notice other things. The camp has a newspaper, printed in German, that provides news of the war. It is censored, of course, but it is not pure propaganda. It reports German victories and Allied setbacks, alongside Allied victories and German setbacks. The prisoners are allowed to discuss what they read, to debate and argue. This, too, is disorienting. In Germany, doubt is dangerous. Questioning the party line can lead to denunciation, arrest, worse. Here, in a prison camp, they are freer to speak their minds than they were in their own country. Some prisoners cling to their Nazi beliefs, insisting that Germany will win, that the Führer is infallible, that this temporary captivity is merely a setback. But others begin to question. They whisper late at night in the barracks, asking each other, "If we are the master race, why do we have less food than our captors? If democracy is weak, why are the democracies defeating us? If our cause is just, why were we lied to about what we would find here?" Summer arrives, and with it a transformation of the landscape. The snow melts, revealing fields of wild flowers and forests thick with green. The prisoners work in the sunshine, their skin tanning, their bodies growing stronger on the steady diet. Some are allowed to work on farms without guards, trusted to return to camp at day's end. This trust is itself a revelation. A young prisoner named Otto Becker, a former factory worker from Essen, is assigned to help an elderly couple on a dairy farm. The couple's only son is serving with the Canadian Army in England. They could hate Otto, could see him as the enemy who might one day face their boy in battle. Instead, they treat him with a kind of weary kindness. The old man teaches him how to milk cows, how to repair a fence, how to read the weather. The old woman insists he come inside for lunch, serving him sandwiches and cold milk at their kitchen table. On the wall hangs a photograph of their son in uniform. Otto cannot meet the eyes in that photograph. He writes in a letter to his mother, later intercepted and read by camp censors. I am treated better by my enemies than I ever was by my own officers. I do not know what to think anymore. The camp commandant, a career officer named Colonel William Morrison, understands something that many of his superiors do not, that the war will eventually end and these prisoners will return to Germany. What they take back with them, what stories they tell, what lessons they learn, will matter in the peace that follows. Morrison is not a soft man. He enforces discipline, punishes infractions, maintains security. But he also believes in the principles for which Canada is fighting: democracy, human dignity, the rule of law. He believes that the best way to defeat Nazi ideology is not to mirror its cruelty, but to demonstrate an alternative. He allows the prisoners to form a camp council, to elect representatives who can bring concerns to the administration. He permits cultural activities, concerts, plays, art classes. He ensures that the Geneva Conventions are scrupulously followed. Some of his fellow officers think him naive, but Morrison has read history. He knows that the harsh treatment of German prisoners in World War I contributed to the bitterness and resentment that fueled the rise of Hitler. He is determined not to repeat that mistake. As the months pass, the psychological transformation deepens. The prisoners begin to see their guards not as faceless enemies, but as individuals. There is Corporal MacLeod, a farmer from Saskatchewan who talks endlessly about his wheat fields and his plans for after the war. There is Private Dubois, a French-Canadian from Quebec who teaches interested prisoners how to play hockey on the frozen pond in winter. There is Sergeant Thompson, a stern but fair man who lost a brother at Dieppe, and yet never takes his grief out on the men under his watch. These relationships are not friendships, exactly. The war still rages, and the divide between captor and captive remains, but they are human connections, and they matter. The symbolic object that comes to represent this transformation is simple: bread. In Germany, bread is rationed, heavy and dark, often mixed with sawdust or potato flour to stretch supplies. In the camp, bread is served at every meal, white and soft, baked fresh in the camp kitchen. It is abundant, taken for granted. For the prisoners, this bread becomes a symbol of everything they are discovering about the world beyond the Reich. It represents abundance in a land they were told was poor. It represents generosity from people they were told were weak. It represents a system that, despite being at war, can still feed its prisoners better than Germany feeds its citizens. One prisoner, a baker by trade, is allowed to work in the camp kitchen. He is astonished by the quality of the flour, the availability of yeast, the lack of substitutes or fillers. He bakes with a joy he has not felt in years, and the smell of fresh bread wafting through the camp becomes a daily reminder of the lies they were told. By 1943, the war has turned decisively against Germany. News filters into the camp of defeats in North Africa, in Russia, in the Atlantic. The prisoners listen to the reports with mixed emotions: fear for their families, relief that the madness might soon end, dread of what will come after. Some still cling to hope of a German miracle weapon, a sudden reversal of fortune. But most have accepted the inevitable. They begin to think about the future, about returning to a Germany that will be defeated, occupied, perhaps destroyed. And they begin to fear that return. They have grown accustomed to full bellies, to heated barracks, to being treated with basic decency. They know what awaits them at home: rubble and ruin, starvation and chaos, the reckoning for 12 years of madness. It is in this context that the requests begin. Quietly at first, then with increasing frequency, prisoners approach the camp administration with an extraordinary question: can we stay? Can we remain in Canada after the war, work as laborers or farmers, build new lives in this country that has treated us better than our own? The requests are unofficial, informal, often expressed with embarrassment. These men are soldiers after all, and there is shame in admitting that they prefer captivity in an enemy nation to freedom in their homeland. But the requests keep coming. Klaus Hartmann writes a formal letter to Colonel Morrison, carefully composed, asking if there might be a way for him to immigrate to Canada after the war. He writes, "I have seen here what a society can be when it is built on principles of fairness and human dignity. I have seen that strength does not require cruelty, that order does not require tyranny. I wish to be part of such a society. I wish to raise my children, if I am blessed to have them, in a place where they will not be taught to hate." The Canadian government, when these requests reach official channels, is uncertain how to respond. There is public sympathy for the prisoners, who are seen as victims of Nazi indoctrination rather than true believers. But there is also political reality. Canadian soldiers are dying overseas, and the idea of allowing enemy prisoners to settle in Canada while the war still rages is controversial. The matter is debated in Parliament, discussed in newspapers, argued over in church basements and union halls. In the end, a compromise is reached. Prisoners will be repatriated to Germany after the war, as required by international law. But those who wish to apply for immigration through normal channels will be allowed to do so once they have returned home and once Germany has been stabilized. It is not the answer the prisoners hoped for, but it is not a rejection either. It is a promise that the door might one day open. The war ends in May 1945. News of Germany's surrender reaches the camp on a spring morning, carried by radio and confirmed by the camp commandant in a brief announcement. There is no celebration among the prisoners, no joy. There is only exhaustion and relief, and a deep, abiding sadness for all that has been lost. They know now the full extent of the crimes committed in their name. The camp newspaper, no longer censored, reports on the liberation of the concentration camps, on the mountains of corpses, on the industrial machinery of genocide. Some prisoners refuse to believe it, insisting it is Allied propaganda, but most know in their hearts that it is true. They remember the whispers back home, the disappearances, the things everyone knew but no one spoke of. They are forced to confront the reality that they served a regime of unparalleled evil, that their uniforms bore the symbols of mass murder, that their silence was complicity. The repatriation begins in the summer of 1945. The prisoners are processed, given travel documents, loaded onto ships bound for Europe. They leave behind the barracks that have been their homes for 5 years, the forests where they worked, the small routines that gave structure to their days. They leave behind the bread, the kindness, the glimpse of a different way of living. As the ships pull away from Canadian docks, many stand at the rails, watching the coastline recede. Otto Becker, the young factory worker who learned to milk cows, weeps openly. He is returning to a city that no longer exists, to a family he does not know if he will find, to a country that has been reduced to rubble and shame. He thinks of the elderly couple on the dairy farm, of their son who survived the war and came home, of the last day when the old woman packed him a lunch for the journey and pressed a small Bible into his hands. "Remember," she said, "that you are more than what you were made to do." Klaus Hartmann keeps his diary through the journey home, through the chaos of occupied Germany, through the long years of reconstruction. He survives the hunger winter of 1946, the currency reform, the division of his country into East and West. He becomes a teacher again, working in a small school in the Western Zone, trying to educate a new generation in the values he learned in a prison camp on the other side of the world. In 1952, his application for Canadian immigration is approved. He boards a ship in Hamburg, crosses the Atlantic once more, and steps onto Canadian soil as a free man. He settles in Ontario, not far from the camp where he was held. He marries, has children, builds a quiet life. He never forgets what he learned in those years of captivity, that the measure of a society is not its strength but its mercy, not its power but its principles. Otto Becker's story is different. He returns to Essen to find his family dead, his home destroyed, his city a landscape of ruins. He works in the reconstruction, hauling bricks and clearing rubble, trying to rebuild not just buildings but some sense of meaning. He applies for Canadian immigration but is denied. His factory work does not qualify him under the skilled labor requirements. He lives out his life in Germany, marrying late, working until his body gives out, but he keeps, until his death in 1987, a photograph of the dairy farm where he worked, and a letter from the old woman who showed him kindness. In his will, he leaves a small sum to a Canadian charity, with a note, "In gratitude for being treated as a human being when I deserved nothing." The camp itself is dismantled after the war, the barracks torn down, the land returned to forest and farmland. There is no monument, no plaque, nothing to mark the place where 2,000 German prisoners spent the war years. But the legacy remains in the men who passed through, in the stories they told, in the lives they built afterward. Some returned to Germany and became leaders in the Reconstruction, bringing with them ideas about democracy and human rights learned in captivity. Others immigrated to Canada and became citizens, contributing to the country that once held them prisoner. A few remained unrepentant Nazis, clinging to the ideology even in the face of overwhelming evidence of its evil. But most fell somewhere in between. Ordinary men who had been swept up in extraordinary evil, who had been given a chance to see an alternative, and who carried that vision with them into the uncertain future. The bread, that simple symbol, appears one final time in the historical record. In 1960, a reunion is held in Toronto for former prisoners and their Canadian guards. It is a small gathering, organized by a veterans group, attended by perhaps 50 men. They are older now, grayer, marked by the years. They share a meal, and on the table is fresh bread, white and soft, baked by a former prisoner who now owns a bakery in the city. They break bread together, these former enemies, and in that simple act is a kind of communion, a recognition of shared humanity that transcends the uniforms they once wore and the flags they once served. A journalist covering the event asks one of the former prisoners why he wanted to stay in Canada, what he saw that changed his mind about everything he had believed. The man thinks for a long moment, then says, "I saw that you could be strong without being cruel. I saw that you could win without destroying. I saw that freedom was not weakness but the greatest strength of all, and I wanted to be part of that. I wanted my children to grow up in a world where bread is abundant and kindness is not a crime." The story of the German prisoners in Canada is not widely known. It does not fit neatly into the narratives we tell about World War II, the heroic battles, the clear lines between good and evil, the triumph of the Allies. It is a quieter story, more ambiguous, more human. It is a story about the power of decency in the face of ideology, about the possibility of redemption, about the long, slow work of changing minds and hearts. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, even in the midst of total war, there are choices to be made about how we treat those in our power. Canada chose to treat its prisoners not as monsters but as men, not with vengeance, but with justice tempered by mercy. That choice did not change the outcome of the war. The battles were won by soldiers and sailors and airmen, by factories and shipyards and farms. But it changed the peace. It sent men back to Germany who had seen another way, who carried with them the seeds of a different future. In the end, the prisoners who begged to stay in Canada were not asking for comfort or safety, though they found both. They were asking for something more fundamental, the chance to live in a society that valued human dignity over racial purity, that chose abundance over scarcity, that believed in the possibility of redemption. They were asking to be part of a world where bread is shared, not hoarded, where kindness is strength, not weakness, where the measure of a nation is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies. Some were granted that chance. Others were not. But all of them carried the memory of what they saw, and that memory, passed down through generations, remains a testament to a simple truth, that the greatest victory over evil is not to destroy those who serve it, but to show them a better way. The forests of Ontario still stand, green in summer, white in winter, indifferent to the human dramas that once unfolded beneath their branches. The farms still produce their harvests. The towns still go about their quiet business. There is no monument to mark what happened here, no tourist attraction, no historical site. But in the memories of families, in the letters preserved in archives, in the diaries kept by men who lived through those years, the story survives. It is a story about bread and kindness, about doubt and transformation, about the long journey from ideology to humanity. It is a story that reminds us that even in war, even in captivity, even in the shadow of the greatest evil the world has known, there is always a choice. We can choose cruelty or mercy, vengeance or justice, hatred or hope. Canada made its choice, and in doing so, it changed not just the lives of 2,000 prisoners, but the shape of the peace that followed and the world we inherited. The young sailor who glimpsed the Canadian coast through a porthole in January 1940, who wondered if everything he had been told was wrong, he was right to wonder. Everything was wrong. But in that wrongness, in the shattering of false certainties, there was the possibility of something true. He learned it in the taste of bread, in the warmth of a stove, in the quiet decency of men who had every reason to hate him but chose not to. He learned that freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the presence of dignity, that abundance is not just material, but moral, that the strongest nations are those that can afford to be merciful. These lessons, learned in a prison camp in the Canadian wilderness, are the lessons that built the post-war world. Imperfect, flawed, but striving towards something better. They are lessons we forget at our peril and remember at our salvation.